so many work on fake accounts and bots. So the whole notion of you're being lied to by people who don't even exist, it's not just that you're being given disinformation, but you're being given disinformation by fake accounts and trolls. And this particular line came from an investigation I did with Adam Maudsley at the Daily Beast into this network of journalists who were fake. They had they created fake profiles about themselves on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter. Many of them had stolen photos from other people's Facebook, and others had actually used AI software to generate fake images of themselves to create these profiles. So there's different levels of kind of fakery there. And then these people were pitching op-eds to international news outlets around the world. And this is, again, coming to this idea that the Middle East is an exporter of this information, pitching op-eds around the world to outlets that publish these fake pieces, these fake articles by journalists who weren't even real, spreading propaganda and disinformation. So the whole line, you're being lied to by people who don't even exist, essentially is actually very true. Yeah, someone writes them, but they're not who they claim to be. And what they're writing is either propaganda or fake news. So that's kind of where that goes down to. And obviously, in addition to all that is the bots and trolls that I do. And I think we really need to emphasize this information. We're moving, well, we exist in a time where we're being lied to en masse in an automated fashion at times by people we can't necessarily trust or whose provenance we don't know, whose identity we don't know. And I think that's a really scary prospect.
Wow, that is incredible. I want to just apologize just for a second there. I think for some reason the live stream didn't go through properly at the very beginning. So I'm just gonna spend a couple of seconds just introducing you again. I really apologize for this.
That's okay, don't worry.
But I'm seeing that it's seems to have only gone through 1 minute ago for some reason. I don't know why there was a delay. But just for the people who are suddenly joining us, this is Marc Owen Jones, who's joining me today for Afternoon Tea and Truth Biscuits, who's an assistant professor at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. And we're talking about disinformation and deception campaigns in the Middle East, and this kind of new idea of digital repression in the Middle East. I obviously I'm fascinated with this subject. I actually lived in Saudi Arabia for a couple of years, and saw aspects of repression very up close. And for me, having seen also things like, the censorship at that time, it's a long time ago, around the time of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, censorship taking place where, you'd have, the newspapers would come in and they would have black mark all the way through it. The censorship was that blatant. But now, from what you're talking about, it's become much more sophisticated and subtle, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the interesting things, and I argue this in the book, is that, Saudi went from this, a place that was almost lethargic or very old school in how it dealt with information. There's that classic story that, when the first Gulf War happened, people found out it a few days after it happened, and by CNN and through CNN, not through local news. And what was interesting about this, following that, you see loads of Saudi investment into satellite infrastructure, into, TV production companies across the Middle East. What you saw was a concerted effort to try and dominate not just the means of producing TV shows, but also the infrastructure. So what you do, you have a highly authoritarian regime investing into this kind of the whole communication apparatus. And with social media and the digital, this is actually spread into that world now. And you see this particularly under Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, is this kind of investment in the technological, the social media, the digital media. You have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, really, of fake accounts, automated accounts, who basically dominate the online space in Arabic. And remember, Arabic spoken in 25 different countries. They dominate this space with pro-Mohammed bin Salman propaganda. And so the idea is that you're kind of monopolizing the public sphere, the places where people can discussion, with propaganda. And it's not just about sheer volume of disinformation. It's about crowding out those other voices. Because in a repressive state, like Saudi, critics have been targeted, critics have been imprisoned. Obviously, this has been embodied most under the the murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy. He was killed, and that was obviously a big signal to any critics of the Saudi regime that you need to be quiet. And there was other things at play, right? And this is what's terrifying about it. We know that Saudi actually attempted to infiltrate Twitter headquarters. The FBI have a case against 2 Saudi citizens for basically going into Twitter and reportedly taking information about Saudi Twitter users and reporting that back to Saudi, right? So how would you feel if you were a dissident, knowing that that even if you were an anonymous activist on Twitter, that there was ways for the regime to get your information? That combined with murder of journalists and this huge army, this kind of troll army, means that the space is co-opted. So the digital space that was once touted as this space where people would be able to kind of lobby for democracy, criticize the government, is really a space that's been co-opted by authoritarian regimes.
This time when we envisioned all these social movements that were going to create an Arab Spring that would spread democracy all across the Middle East, and this fantasy, you know, like, I mean, this really is a fantasy, isn't it? It's not emerged at all. I mean, there's been a couple of cases, haven't there? That
there was scope for optimism, and I understand why people were optimistic. But this was the paradigm of liberation technology, right? Technology would liberate people from their shackles of whatever oppression they had. But I make a case for neoliberation technology, right, which is a play on terms of neoliberalism. So neoliberation technology is the idea that tech companies, right, most of the ones that we've talked about that were sort of touted as these kind of important actors in the Arab uprisings were like Facebook, Twitter, American companies, right? Yeah. And what's interesting about those is that those companies used to thrive on this idea that they were encouraging free speech, and anyone who wanted to rein them in was probably accused of like harming free speech. But the whole notion of neoliberalism is unfettered trade, access to the world with minimal barriers, right? So these social media companies that we know work on a profit-based model, it's not just about profits, it's about markets, right? So for them, obtaining new markets, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere, is imperative. So the notion of neoliberation is this idea that you're not liberating, the technology isn't liberating people. It's the idea that these markets are being liberated for these social media companies in this realm of neoliberalism to monetize them. Yes. And the thing that would affect their business model was that if these markets were actually regulating that technology. So I think we have to be very careful, because these companies have used this notion, this Western-centric notion of liberation to market their goods. But what those tools have been co-opted by those regimes and used as a tool of repression. And when I say repression here, I don't just mean the coercive physical violence, because repression generally is considered any action taken by usually a state or other person to weaken a social movement.
Yeah.
And so that can be through disruption to information operations. If you can disrupt the networking between activists, if you can use social media or any media to demonize or harm the reputation of a social movement, all these things, spread propaganda, this is all part of repression, right? And so I think this is what we need to bear in mind about social media.
Yeah, and they're used in a totalitarian way. Propaganda goes on all the way around the world. But what perhaps we need to bear in mind when we're talking about these kinds of regimes is the coupling of propaganda to these kinds of other repressive technologies of surveillance and force and coercion, and that being worked all the way through daily life, essentially.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, if we're talking about media as intimidation, if you look at how people used to be punished throughout history, in a town square, people would be lashed, beheaded, whatever. The idea of a public spectacle of harm was to deter other people from engaging in that. So if you have a video of police violence being circulated in any country, but like say Bahrain or Saudi, which was common, you can have two effects. People can see that video and be angry, and maybe that will encourage them to go to the streets to protest, or it will intimidate them because they see what the consequences of getting involved in protests are: police violence. Yeah. So it's a double-edged sword. So we need to get away from this idea that technology is liberating or not. It's instrumentalized and it can be used in different ways. The violence aspect is key. But at the same time, I really want to emphasize the fact that whilst technology is being used by authoritarian regimes, the chain, and I call this the deception order, the connection between the various actors
Yeah.
is complex. You know, you have authoritarian states, but you have tech companies, but you also crucially have these PR companies, whether it's Cambridge Analytica or otherwise, who monetize the fact that there are authoritarian regimes who wish to disrupt social movements. That's their business model. It's like, hey, look, there's an authoritarian regime. They're like an arms company. War is, in theory, good for trade. Authoritarian regimes are good for this disinformation service or this propaganda service we're offering. Yeah. And I document this a few times in the book is, you know, the use of Western, particularly British companies, but also American companies, who play a key role in spreading this disinformation, some of which is actually, you know, you could argue easily is contributing to societal tensions in the regions and conflict. So you literally have companies who are based in Mayfair, have all this legitimacy of being based in, you know, the shiny kind of most expensive postcode in the UK and one of the most expensive in the world, people wearing suits, whose day job is to basically sell human rights abusers the ability to kind of repress their population further.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that brings us to one of the questions that our audience have sent in. So Azza El Masri has said, it's interesting to think the revolving door within Twitter, about the revolving door within Twitter. There are instances of Twitter employees, as you said, who've worked, who were planted in Twitter and may have been like reporting back. But Azza is asking about employees that might have worked for other intelligence units, such as the UK, and whether you know anything about this.
I mean, you know, it's no secret that most intelligence services in the world have tried to cozy up with Facebook or Twitter because they know that the power of those platforms, but also the potential wealth of information on them. The problem is, but we don't know the mechanisms of reporting via, you know, intelligence networks that social media companies actually have. And I would almost be certain that, you know, Facebook or Twitter have some sort of mechanisms by which they report or can report certain bits of information to the intelligence services. Having said that, you know, there's anecdotal evidence that, we know that there's elements of the British Armed Forces who use social media for engaging in propaganda, essentially. Was it the 77th Brigade or something like that? So that's a very real thing.
I think the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, where you know, governments feed into this kind of process where they can report on, you know, terrorist activities that are going on the platforms. And indeed, you know, governments do need an ability to say, you know, like, take down this person's video. They're you know, publicizing a massacre on
Absolutely. Facebook. I mean, and that the sad thing is that in theory can be abused, even though it's a necessary function. I mean, the thing is but intelligence agencies often don't work in straightforward or obvious ways. You know, they might have middlemen, they might have relationships with other agencies or organizations that can involve themselves in these activities. I mean, there was that classic example of Bell Pottinger, who are now defunct. Again, a very quote unquote reputable British company who did PR for dictators and whose demise came around after the basically almost incited race riots in South Africa. One of the things they did was, when they were working in Iraq, was install tracking links in certain videos that were then disseminated in order that the intelligence services could then locate extremists, right? So we do know that these organizations, who are PR companies, who do many other things, were also working alongside the intelligence organizations. And we don't know the necessary extent of that in Twitter or other orgs, but I would imagine that there is definitely intent to either infiltrate them or mechanisms of reporting that exist, and they're important to bear in mind.
Yes, thank you. And I wanted to, since we've gone off a little bit out of the way of talking about the media and the repression of the media, and I think it's quite important, the Twitter thread that you came out with this week. I wanted to bring us back to that because you were posting about a journalist who actually had been subjected to this kind of campaign, and I think this is highly relevant because these campaigns that are being, pushed out by these actors in the Middle East are actually silencing journalism, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean,
example.
Being a journalist online these days is difficult. Being a woman journalist, I think, is even more difficult for many reasons, being mostly patriarchy and the online misogyny is endemic. But the thread in the journal article I actually published recently was about an attack on a Al Jazeera journalist, Ghada Awais, who she's an anchor for Al Jazeera, again, Doha based. And she, I mean, there's a bit of political context here. In 2017, Qatar, where Al Jazeera is based, was basically isolated by Saudi, UAE, and Egypt. And so what you saw was this media campaign attacking Al Jazeera because they accused Al Jazeera of supporting the Arab uprisings and supporting terrorism and very other kind of spurious allegations. However, what that meant is Al Jazeera journalists were a particular target for both influence operations, propaganda operations, also surveillance operations. So in 2020, Citizen Lab, which is an organization who works in the University of Toronto, they discovered at the time, and this was before a big leak of 50,000 names, that Pegasus, which is an Israeli, a company called NSO Group, an Israeli company, makes spyware, which when it gets on your phone or your computer, basically it can take over your camera, your keystrokes, it can see everything basically. The largest group of people known to have been targeted by that spyware were Al Jazeera journalists, up to 36 of them. So it was clear that this organization was being targeted by actors based in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The interesting thing about the attack on Ghada was it seemed like a coordinated kind of a holistic attack, right? So basically one evening she just started getting thousands of notifications, and there was a hashtag basically. It sounds esoteric, but it was the farm of Hamad bin Therma. Hamad bin Therma is the chairman of Al Jazeera, and it was pictures of Ghada in a bikini that had been stolen from a phone, probably using Pegasus, right? And these photos were being taken out of context, and it was being said that this photo of her in a bikini was taken at the chairman's house, basically, and that there was all these other cartoons and this other kind of, these other images, stories of her basically sleeping with the chairman in order to gain her promotion. Absolute nonsense.
Oh my God.
Entirely misogynistic disinformation and classic misogynistic tropes, painting women as libidinous, as mercenary. But it wasn't just, this wasn't just the odd account. This was thousands and thousands of accounts, all attacking her, calling her things from slut to whore, and being taken up by known influence as well. So in addition to thousands of kind of anonymous type accounts with some bots, you had ministers, heads of the police, verified blue tick accounts with millions of followers spreading this disinformation. And then it breaking out. And by breakout, I mean, when it goes beyond social media into established legacy press. So you had official news organizations in the region taking up the story if it was real. The extent of misinformation was that there were doctored tweets, there was just false content, and there was no attempt to actually try and regulate this. And the established legacy outlets that were doing it were branded ones. You had CNN Arabia, you had Sky News Arabia, you had the Independent, the Arabic version. And because the Independent now is partly owned by the Saudi company, right? So they bought out India Arabia, India Persian, India Urdu. So what you actually see is a totally different editorial line. So the India Arabia is essentially like now a propaganda outlet for the Saudi government. And they were just using it to attack this woman journalist, this lone woman journalist, and intimidate her into silence. And we see this all over the world. In India, for example, even today, there's a campaign going against a journalist who wrote or criticized the Saudi bombing of Yemen. 70,000 tweets, I think, in a few hours, and many of which are just, again, calling her slut and a whore. I mean, it's outrageous, but it happens.
That's horrifying. I'm so sorry. One of the people who's commented in the chat, Tree Plant, comes up with a very good question about this term disinformation that gets used a lot.
Right.
You're generally using the term deception.
Yeah.
Can you explain why you're using this different term? And Tree Plant says it seems that every news outlet has some kind of bias. So where is the line where disinformation starts? We should clarify that disinformation is deliberate falsehood.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about deception, this is something bigger than that, isn't it? Can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah, so let's say, I mean, for the benefit of some who might not know, and apologies if you do, misinformation is obviously accidentally spread false information. Disinformation, as Emma said, is information that's false, spread deliberately with intent to deceive. Malinformation is truthful information spread with malicious context, like a doxed photo, like a revenge porn would be malinformation. And then you have things like propaganda. Now, propaganda can be true or false, but it's the intention there is to influence people. And I think the reason I use deception is because let's take an example. You could have 1,000 accounts spreading something truthful. That would be considered, say it was truthful, but it was like a political message or something. That could be propaganda. It wouldn't technically be disinformation. But if those accounts are fake, then the means of spreading that information is misleading. So that's why I think deception is important, because deception carries the mode of delivery as well as the content itself. And I do think, yeah, I mean, when we talk about bias in newspapers, that's one thing. But in some cases, we have newspapers that, I mean, we have dozens now set up for the purpose of misinformation. But I think many newspapers are acting, you know, a lot of them are acting with good intentions, with no intention to mislead. And then so I think, you know, deception is more about the means of delivery, which can tell us a lot about the intent as well, right? Yeah. Someone spreading a message with 1,000 fake accounts, their intention is not good, or their intention is to do something that's not transparent, right? So yeah, that's why I use the term deception.
And I would say as well that, you know, you have, when it comes to deception, you're talking about like creating a new reality, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And when you
pseudo reality, it's pseudo public.
Yeah, this is very different to bias or political argument or ideology. You know, when we say disinformation, we are talking like verifiable falsehood. And you should be able to, if you're calling it disinformation, you should be able to prove that that person intended, that it's being done deliberately.
Yeah, and that's hard though, isn't it, Emma? I mean, to prove it is hard. And again, this is why
high standard to call it.
Yeah, but this is why in many ways, again, looking at the means of dissemination can be a useful barometer for looking for malicious intent, right? You can say, well, there's something untoward going on here, because if they wanted this to be an honest thing, why would they use all these fake accounts to spread it? Potentially, I mean, it is a high bar.
Unethical without being false, you know? You're distorting a message.
Yeah.
Even if it's truthful, but you're like swaying it in such a way that it is misleading people. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's still you know, a misrepresentation. Even
absolutely. I mean, I think some things are entirely clear. Like, you know, the campaign I just mentioned against the woman journalist.
Yeah.
Those photos were not taken at a farm; they were taken at a home, right? That's false. You know, I mean, if a newspaper then started reporting that was taken at a farm, that would be false. We don't necessarily know the intent, but we can assume in a place where there's state-controlled media that do not change the story after being corrected, that there is some malice there, either malice or incompetence. I don't know. I mean, but then again, incompetence, you know, that could be misinformation that gets people off the hook, you know. And maybe there needs to be another brand of false news that is spread because of incompetence. Incompetence. I don't know. I'll think of something.
Propaganda.
Yeah, that could work. Incompaganda.
I like it. So, what do we do about all this? We have a few minutes left. What would you say are your most, you know, the solutions that you would most eagerly put forward, bearing in mind that Arab countries, I don't want to be you know, generalizing, but there hasn't been a great deal of optimism around many of these countries in the Middle East anyway, doing anything to protect people's privacy and restrain themselves in this area. So so in that case, bearing in mind authoritarian tendencies towards this, what do you suggest we do? Or can anything be done?
It's tricky. I mean, I think, you know, again, this goes back to the neoliberal paradigm. These technologies conceived of in a totally different context in the West Coast are being used across regimes of all kinds. So where does the burden of regulation, etc.? At the moment, we do rely a lot on social media companies, which is problematic. But at the same time, if you have authoritarian regimes regulate them, and they do regulate it, it's often just for the benefit of authoritarian regimes. So in many cases, you know, if social media companies in theory would have to step up, but then so would the regulatory bodies in places like the US. Obviously in the EU are doing more to try and rein in the roles of social media companies. Authoritarian regimes could, in theory, do that.
Yes.
The issue is, to what extent actually are they just benefiting too much from the repressive capacity of social media that they would refuse to do it? And I think in some countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, that they wouldn't want to do it because there's a net benefit to the presence of social media. So I think it again comes down to pressuring social media companies, to activists, to actually implement safeguards that would help activists and help civil society. I think that's the only way we can reasonably see this, unless we escalate it to an international issue. I mean, let's not forget, propaganda for war is actually against international law and the ICCPR. So, maybe we could really go nuclear and just mobilize the international law argument against propaganda.
Well, I would also add that, these companies are kind of beholden to the countries in which they will be, operating. So they have to obey the laws of the places where they are. And there's a limit to how much one can say, isn't there, about, well, you're based in the US, so therefore you do what we say abroad, if they're operating in those other countries. And this has been the tension and the dilemma. And, basically the social media companies have been making deals all around the world with these different regimes and rulers and so on. So to what extent should local laws be followed by social media companies? Do you?
Well, I think again, this is absolutely true, and we've seen many examples. I mean, for example, there was a Netflix episode of the Patriot Act with Hassan Minhaj that criticized MBS. Saudi said that broke their local law, so Netflix took it down in that market, and Netflix are just obeying local law.
Yeah.
I think when that need to obey local law actually starts then to infringe on human rights or abet authoritarianism, that's when we get a problem. And there's clear examples of this which blow my mind. So for example, you and I both know that political advertising on Twitter is not allowed under their terms and conditions. They believe that political clout should be earned, not bought, right? However, if you dig into their FAQ, because I was looking at this propaganda campaign in Saudi that was kind of lionizing the Mohammed bin Salman. I remember there's no real elections in Saudi. I was like, surely this counts political advertising, because there was hundreds of thousands of accounts saying we all support Mohammed bin Salman, and it was, and I was like, surely it does. So I looked on Twitter, and then I found in the FAQs a question saying, is political advertising? No circumstances. What about displays of loyalty or salutations of approval to leaders? Yes, that's allowed in cultural context. I'm like, seriously? So in an authoritarian regime where there's no democratic president, it's actually fine essentially to do political advertising, because in that context, it's like, well, people don't have a choice. You can celebrate an authoritarian leader, that's not political advertising, but you can't use Twitter in a democratic country to actually facilitate your election campaign. I thought, this is perverse.
Ironic. Yes.
But I think you can have, the arms trade is an example. It's an extreme example, but that's regulated, right? You have export controls in countries in which arms dealers or arms makers export countries. There's checks and balances, right? In theory, the same logic could apply to social media companies. Yeah. If it's determined from a human rights due diligence perspective, and there's plenty of ways of analyzing this. If you look at Reporters Without Borders, you look at human rights indexes, is this technology going to be exploited in a repressive capacity? Yes, then the social media company has to make an argument that it can export it, right? I know it sounds draconian, but we really need to get away from this argument that frames social media unequivocally as a tool of freedom of expression, because this is actually compounding the problem, right? At some point, you have to make this decision or an analysis. On the whole, is this tool being used for good or bad within that context? Yeah. And as a country in which that company operates, should we allow an export license to be given, right?
The difficulty, though, then comes if we say, okay, no, you're not allowed to do that. That's against human rights. And the company refuses. What's that ruler then going to do? They're probably going to just shut down that network. Yeah?
Yeah, they probably would.
So if that's Twitter, and this is the network that people use to mobilize their dissent, then are we then creating a problem of, disabling people's voices in the process?
Well, I mean, this is if we think that there is a general net benefit to the existence of that social network. If it's deemed that that's not the case, then, it's not the case, right? So, yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm not saying it's a straightforward issue. People mobilize before social media, and they'll mobilize after. And the question, again, is just how to what extent is it actually being a useful or not a useful tool? And I think that's something that needs to be asked. It is an extreme option, and I don't think it's a feasible, realistic option, because I think there'd be ways around it, but you could also encourage regulations. But I think at least human rights due diligence in those countries by those social media companies, or an obligation to do that in terms of a legislative thing, would make them build in further safeguards, I think.
Yeah, and I think you're right. This was such a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Marc. I really appreciate you joining me here.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. Everybody, please do subscribe if you enjoyed our conversation today. I really appreciate the audience attending, and I'm going to have another episode of Afternoon Tea and Truth Biscuits in 2 weeks, where I'm going to be talking to Laura Edelman from NYU about her research on Facebook and how Facebook reacted to that research and tried to shut her down. Well, actually shut her down. So we're going to be talking about more repressive measures, but this time more focused on US elections in 2 weeks. Thank you, everybody. And thanks again, Marc, for joining me. It's been so much fun chatting with you over Afternoon Tea and Truth Biscuits. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.